Hello, my name is Irene Parker. I'm the Engagement, Education and Prevention Manager at the Victorian Ombudsman's Office. Welcome to the next in our lineup of behind-the-scenes series of webinars. We'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Victoria, by acknowledging their connections to community and to culture. And this week is also Reconciliation Week. And so we extend our welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly those who may be joining us today. We're beaming in from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. The purpose of today is to cover the complaint handling process as broadly as possible. If anyone requires specific details about any of the discussion points we cover today, please contact our office directly. Let's get to our panellists. We have here today the Victorian Ombudsman, Deborah Glass. Deborah has been the Victorian Ombudsman since 9 years. She is a lawyer and was raised in Victoria before working overseas in regulatory and oversight roles. She returned to Melbourne in 2014 to take up the role of Victorian Ombudsman. Michael Heffernan is the Principal Officer for Alternative Dispute Resolution in the Victorian Ombudsman's Office. Michael is a dispute resolution specialist, an accredited mediator, and is responsible for setting up the Victorian Ombudsman's conciliation function. Ben Zika has been with the Victorian Ombudsman for nearly 5 years, working across multiple roles. His current role is that of Principal Officer for Complaints Strategy. He works towards improving complaint handling across the public sector and does that by conducting reviews into complaint handling processes and practices in public sector agencies. So welcome to you all. Deborah, I'll start with you. I have personally heard you say that agencies should learn to love their complaints. Why is that?
Well, glad you asked me that question, Irene. Complaints are free feedback, and you probably heard me say that too.
I have.
And the reason they are free feedback is that they are members of the public who are letting you know what they think of your service. And if you don't know that something's wrong, then you can't fix it. So it really is about seeing it as that continuous improvement opportunity to go, okay, well, what's going on here? Now, as I say that, what I'm really conscious of is that many people, complaints have a bit of a bad rap, even the word itself can be quite negative. And people tend to think of complaints in terms of, of people who behave badly, who exhibit challenging behaviour, who you want to get rid of, and it makes you feel sort of naturally defensive when somebody confronts you. And this is, in large part, what we need to turn around. Because, yes, it is true that complaints can be vexatious. It's true that complainants can demonstrate challenging behaviours. But I've actually been working in the complaints business for quite a few decades now. And I can tell you that the vast majority of complaints are made in good faith. And they are made because somebody wants to tell you what's wrong. So it's really important, we can have further conversations about this, to sometimes to strip out some of the behaviours and attitudes that might come with the complaint and see the complaint for what it is. And that's somebody wants you to know that something has gone wrong and it's in your interests to fix it.
Thank you. Ben, on a practical level, can you talk us through the processes you follow when you receive a complaint? What are the initial considerations and assessments?
Sure. The first thing you think about, or the first consideration, is what is the complaint about? What is the person who's contacted you complaining about? Seems like a bit of a truism, but really often people who come to an agency like the Ombudsman have had a long history with the agency they're complaining about. There's a lot of narrative you might need to condense, find out what the actions are and the various decisions that are key to that complaint. And then the next logical step is, what would that person like done, or what needs to be done to resolve that complaint? And that can be any number of things. And a majority of complaints we get at the Victorian Ombudsman relate to communication issues or delays, so people feel like they're not being heard or they haven't heard back from an agency. So the resolution or the outcome for those is pretty straightforward. And I guess that then leads into the third consideration, which is what is our role? One of the primary things we think about when we consider our role is, has the person had an opportunity or has the agency had an opportunity to consider that complaint first? It's a concept of, I guess, procedural fairness, that the agency should get the first shot at resolving the complaint. But we consider what the complainant's circumstances are. They may be quite fatigued from a series of back and forth with an agency. They might have capacity issues or barriers to bringing a complaint. So we factor all that in to deciding whether there's a role for us initially and what type of action we can take.
Okay, thank you. Michael, conciliation is a relatively new tool in the Ombudsman toolkit. How does it work? And how does it differ from the approach Ben has just been talking to us about?
Thanks, Irene. So it's about 15 months now that we've been resolving complaints using conciliation in our office. I think people are generally aware of what conciliation is, a form of alternative dispute resolution, similar to mediation. And I guess, how is it different? It really puts complainants and public organisations at the centre of our attempt to resolve a complaint. So it can be very empowering in that way. It really opens the doors for complainants and public organisations to be able to talk to each other in a really structured setting of a way to fix the problem that's being presented. Deborah talked about complaints are someone saying something's gone wrong, and often the public organisation isn't the best place to resolve that. But for lots of reasons, sometimes that's very difficult when there's not a third party there. So that's the kind of role we play. Our conciliators are empowered to kind of intervene and suggest and recommend. So we're guiding the process, we're facilitating the discussion, always with the kind of resolution in mind. So in terms of how the process works, we have discussions before any conciliation with complainants and organisations separately about the complaint, but also about the process and what they'd like to get out of it. And then we bring people together in person or online in a meeting, effectively, and they can be up to 3 hours long. We go over the process at the start of the meeting, and then we give the complainant an opportunity to talk about their experience and what's brought them there. And that can be really powerful, particularly when you have senior representatives of organisations sitting in the room, hearing about how their services have been experienced. We then offer the organisation an opportunity to respond. And then we get into the nitty-gritty of negotiating and kind of trying to move them forward to a resolution. We can break a private session sometimes, but really the emphasis is on, okay, well, now we've got this problem, how's it going to be fixed? What's the solution? It might be acknowledgements, it might be apologies, but often it's about organisations agreeing to take further steps. And at the conclusion of that process, we as Ombudsman conciliators kind of give our view about whether that discussion and commitments and what has come out of the conciliation resolves the complaint.
A couple of terms I've heard you use there, and that's mediation and conciliation. What's the difference between the two?
I guess, this comes out of kind of 1970s America, really, mediation. So mediation is a very facilitative, effectively mediators don't have a say and they facilitate the process, whereas as Ombudsman conciliators, and this is the difference with conciliation, we have a say and we're giving a view about the reasonableness and the fairness as we go through the process. So I'll give you an example. If a complainant comes to the meeting and talks about their experience and we can see some problems with their experience, that something hasn't gone quite right, and an organisation doesn't seem to be understanding that, we might do it in the joint session, or we might break with them and say, look, we're really concerned about that person's experience. This is an opportunity now to fix it. So what are you planning to do about that? So that's the difference. And our conciliation function is a little bit different than other conciliation functions in that ultimately it's us as Ombudsman conciliators that decide whether a complaint has been resolved by conciliation. That's because the Ombudsman is omnipresent in all our complaints. So it's a necessary part of our offering that we're always testing the outcomes of conciliation against reasonableness and fairness. And if we don't think we've got those outcomes, then we move it into a different process in our office.
Thank you. Deborah, I understand your office is often spoken about in the context of formal investigations, something we discussed on Tuesday. How important is the work you do to informally resolve complaints?
Oh, it is our bread and butter. And if we look at the numbers, the formal investigations, a few dozen a year, and that's out of about 20,000 jurisdictional complaints we receive every year. And out of those, many thousands go through the process that Ben described earlier. So the core work of the office is our informal resolution of complaints. And just some, really obviously, some examples that are in the public domain. I mean, looking at public housing, looking at, fines Victoria, or I've just, birth, deaths and marriages, some of the when people come to us, when people come to the office, by and large, they're not looking for an investigation. Some are, like you, and some are not reasonable. But most people aren't looking for an investigation. They're looking for a resolution. They may be at the end of their tether. They go, I need to get a passport. I've got to go overseas. It's an urgent matter. I can't get a copy of my child's birth certificate or a marriage certificate or whatever because I can't get through to the registry. Complain to the Ombudsman, and usually from the kind of process that Ben described, we can fix that with a phone call. So it's not about, so the informal resolution is absolutely the bread and butter of our work.
Then what can public organisations do to quickly assist, to assist in quickly and informally resolving complaints?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I guess when we come to an agency, it's because we're making inquiries to help try and facilitate some kind of resolution. And often we'll only have part of the story. We'll only have the information the complainant's given us and the broader understanding of the scheme or program or area that they're complaining about. So I guess the first thing to consider, or the first thing to keep in mind when we come to make an inquiry, is that we only have part of the story, and it's an opportunity to explain all the circumstances. That doesn't need to be done in a formal response. It can be a phone call or a short meeting. And so really being ready to give us all the information and all the circumstances we need. And the next is about I guess the mindset, and that we are looking, as Deborah said, we receive tens of thousands of complaints a year, and we investigate very few. So we usually come in seeking a resolution. So coming with a resolution mindset is a really, really important step. The example Deborah used before about people coming to us with public housing issues. A lot of people come to us with complaints about maintenance or issues with their public housing dwellings. So really talking us through what are the steps that are needed to fix that problem, to address that issue, to fix the leak or the mould or whatever it is really going to be helpful. And I guess the last thing I think is important is to, I guess, be realistic with us about what can be achieved. We're not going to be holding people to any kind of, I guess, precedence. If a discretion is exercised in a particular case, we're not going to be coming back later and saying, well, you took those steps in this particular case. We're now going to assume that's the case in future. Being flexible and realistic about what can be done to resolve a matter is really important. And I guess the thing I like to say to agencies often, and I know we have a lot of agencies who receive our inquiries in the session today. I can understand how it might be a bit daunting. You get a list of formal questions made under 13A of the Ombudsman Act. That doesn't mean you can't pick up the phone and just talk us through what's happened. And definitely that's usually the quickest way to get to the kind of the core of a matter, is a quick discussion about what the complaint is about.
Well, that brings me to my next question. We've talked about informal complaint resolution, but what tips a complaint, and it being the bread and butter of our office, but what tips a complaint from being informally resolved into being formally resolved? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, I mean, I guess an informal resolution is where the parties have come to some kind of a position where the matter is no longer an issue for the complainants. The problem has been fixed. The communication has been made. You know, we have a lot of facilitating contacts kind of outcomes for people. So that's the formal side of things. From a formal perspective, we look at what are the Ombudsman's powers under the Act, and when can the Ombudsman determine that a complaint no longer needs to be on our books, so to speak. But that's really an internal decision for our staff, is about when it's formally closed. That doesn't mean when we close a complaint that a complainant can't come back to us later, and definitely with issues to do with communication or complaints that have a long-standing relationship with the relevant agency, they can't come back to us if issues arise again.
Michael, the conciliation function is a fairly new form of complaints resolution in the Ombudsman's office. How can other agencies identify whether they should consider this option in their complaint resolution arsenal?
Yeah, well, Deborah talked about learning to love your complaints, and I think at its fundamental core, conciliation is about really understanding at a very deep level what a complaint is about. And it provides an opportunity really to understand what the person's experience has been. So I think organisations should always be exploring different avenues of doing that. And there's no doubt that conciliation or mediation provides another way to do that. And I think it really can allow organisations to cut to the chase, figure out quickly what the problem is, and with senior decision makers in the room, really fix the problem quickly. Because often, by the time a complaint gets to us and by the time it comes through our conciliation process, the answers are relatively obvious. Some of the times it just needs someone senior there seeing the entire picture, understanding their organisation, understanding the decisions that are open to them, the discretion they have, and then just getting on with it. So that's kind of, I think conciliation provides that opportunity. And organisations should be exploring various different methods to understand their complaints and to come up with different resolutions. And it's quick, relatively.
Okay. Thank you.
Saves the paperwork.
Oh, definitely. I love that part of it.
Deborah, in your experience of reviewing the complaint handling process of other agencies and local government, what would you say is the single most important area of focus for improving complaint handling?
Well, it would have to be communication, and it's the thing, as Ben has already indicated, it's a huge theme, but communication has a number of, I think operates on a number of levels, and from my experience, I've seen how communication is important, both to manage expectations of in the complaint scenario, which may be completely unrealistic, but also in the form of active listening. And let me just give you an example of how this might work. I recall an incident in our office some years ago where we began a regional program, going around regional Victoria and taking complaints from the public, which is something that we hadn't done actively for a long time. So here we were in a city in regional Victoria, and we'd invited people. We had no idea how many people would turn up. We invited them to come along, and you get to talk to an ombudsman officer and you can make your complaint. So again, it was all a bit of a surprise as to whether anybody would be there at all. And our complaints people sort of set up, their little operations in some public building in the town, and I came around there just to have a look and see how it was going. And there was a lot of people there, which was pretty good. And I was buttonholed by somebody who wanted to tell me all about his complaint. And I listened to him for a little while, and I had to go, and I said, look, I don't want you to have to repeat yourself because I know you're going to be speaking to one of my officers, but I already knew from what he'd said to me that it was a complaint where we were not going to be able to help him. And I knew because he told me that he'd driven nearly an hour from some even more remote part of the state to get here because he had this complaint that was very old. It was well out of jurisdiction. So I had all the, and I didn't want to say any of these things because I knew he was going to speak to someone. So I went off to do some other things, and I happened to, one of which was a meeting with a local MP. And as I was coming out of the meeting with a local MP, who should walk in but this man who had come to make a complaint. And, my heart sank, and I thought, oh dear, how did that go? And he, barreled up to us, he obviously knew the local MP knew him. And he said, oh, I've got to tell you about my complaint. And the MP quickly said, have you spoken to the Ombudsman? And which he said, yes, I have. And I said, heart in my mouth, how did it go? And he said, wonderful. And I'm thinking, what happened? Oh my goodness. So he was singing the praises of the office and whoever was dealing with him. So I'm thinking, terrific. I go back to where we're dealing with complaints, and I say, what happened? Who dealt with this person who was clearly making a complaint that was very old and out of about all kinds of ages that we could not help with. And it was one of my excellent staff who said, oh, that was me. And what that was a pure exercise in really fabulous communication. So what she did was two things. She actively listened to him. And a big part of what people sometimes think is that they just want to be heard. So she actively listened and she managed his expectations. Communication. It's amazing when you do it well, what you can solve.
Could I just add to that? Because I love that example. I've heard it before. I think it's also a really important example about empowering your frontline staff, and all of the good practice material and the complaint handling standards and so forth do talk about you should focus as much resources and energy on frontline complaint resolution. And I think that's a great example of it. And we've seen lots of agencies around that have complex triage processes and escalation processes, and that is needed. You need to be able to review complaints, you need oversight and those sorts of things. But training and supporting your frontline staff to be able to confidently deal with people and resolve complaints is a really key part of practice.
And just to make one further point, thanks, Ben. Absolutely agree with that. The other thing I think we all need to recognise is that very often we can't help someone. And that applies to us as an Ombudsman office, and it may be because, for all kinds of reasons, it may be because the actions of the agency were reasonable, and they have unreasonable expectations about what can be achieved. It may be because we simply don't deal with the matter at hand. So a very big part of complaints handling is developing strategies for delivering bad news. It's actually, it's quite easy when there is an outcome you can achieve that everybody will be happy with. But very often in complaints handling, it doesn't get to that stage because there actually isn't anything you can do. So the art of communication there, which is just so important, is really, as my story illustrates, is the art of delivering bad news in a way that somebody feels heard.
Couple of points. I'm loath to ask the next question. One, because you've preempted it, but I think it's worth asking. What does happen if you fail? What happens if conciliation fails?
Yeah, good question. It's not failing much at the moment. I think about over 90% of the complaints that go through conciliation are resolved by the conciliation process. So, which is a great number for us, and I think it goes to the work that goes in beforehand and the constructive dialogue that we're facilitating during conciliation. When it doesn't work, I guess we need to make a decision as conciliators as to whether we think there is any practical resolution that our office could achieve outside of the conciliation, or if there are other reasons that our office should have further involvement in a complaint. So if we put in the effort and we've gone through the conciliation and we don't get an outcome, we may close it on the basis that, you know, we're not going to be able to achieve anything further by having more involvement in the complaint. If we think there's something there, and mainly that happens where an organisation hasn't turned up in good faith, or we don't think that their actions and their explanations are reasonable and fair, we then send it through potentially to our team that deal with complex complaints, or indeed to our investigations area for them to consider, based using their discretion, whether they should look further into the complaint.
And then what happens if an inquiry fails?
Well, I mean, I guess there's two ways to look at it. If an inquiry fails with a agency, we'll probably go back and make further inquiries, or we might seek to have a meeting and kind of ventilate those issues. Ultimately, the Ombudsman does have the power to investigate complaints, and so that's something that's ever present in these kind of discussions, but as has been discussed today, not addressed, not dealt with often. I guess failing for a complainant's perspective is much more common, and it gets back to the question you asked before about resolution. You know, what does a resolved complaint look like to a member of the public, or to a complainant, or to us? And so for us, we make sure with agencies that we review, we make sure that there are clear escalation processes and internal review processes, and in most cases, external review processes. But I think even before that, and this is building on Deborah's comments before about communication, foreshadowing the kind of decisions you're making, giving people the opportunity to hear your preliminary views if you're a complaint handler, and giving comments so people understand that they're given every opportunity to put their case forward, is a really important part of managing circumstances where we might not be able to, or our assistance is really going to be limited.
Well, it might be a good opportunity now to take a question from the floor, and that's to ask, what is the office's views on issuing apologies as part of a complaint outcome?
Well, I think I can take that one. I'm a big fan of apologies, as I hope everybody in the state knows,
yes.
The country actually. And we put out a report on apologies. So for anybody in the audience who wants to know in detail what an apology should look like and what are the features to it, how does it work, we did a guide on apologies, I think in 2017. So we'll put the link into the
yes.
into it. So take a look for yourself. But there are certain features that have to come with an apology, but they have to be genuine. You know? So but we do know that apologies are a really effective way of just taking the sting out of something. And Michael, I think you've got a really good example of an apology working in the cemetery and that.
So we received complaints about a cemetery trust and remembrance parks in Bendigo, and some stuff had gone on there that had been really distressing for people in that items had been removed from graves, and a complainant came to our office and he'd had a vase on his mum's grave for over 20 years, and it had real sentimental attachment to him. He'd gone and spent the money when he was young to put this vase on the grave, and then it had been taken and put in the rubbish. And I think, through our inquiry process and the process that Ben's talked a lot about, we understood from the organisation they accepted that things hadn't been done well and that there were problems, and they had explained to us the steps they were taking to rectify that. And in terms of our systemic lens, or our kind of lens of whether something seriously needs to be looked at by our office in depth, the answers we were getting from the organisation told us that they understood the situation and were taking the appropriate steps to rectify it. But again, that didn't help this person because the vase was gone. It had been thrown away. So we spoke to the organisation and said, look, we think your responses are reasonable. We can understand the steps you're taking. You're conducting internal reviews, you're setting up community consultation groups, you're offering psychology sessions to people. But we think there's an opportunity here for you to come and meet with this person and to hear their experience and to say sorry. And so we did that with everyone volunteering to participate in that. And the Cemetery Trust did a good job of sitting there, hearing the experience, and a genuine apology. and saying sorry, because they should have. It was the right thing to do. And I think that the response from the complainant after that conciliation was that he felt heard and he understood they were taking responsibility, and it felt like they were taking responsibility. It's almost a feeling in your body as to whether someone is actually understanding the impact that they've had on you. And I just echo what Deborah's said about apologies and the power of them, and making it a good apology, actually being genuine about it. It's not that hard. It shouldn't be. Maybe practice it, but it should come from a genuine place. It really should. And you know, in our work we hear sad stories and difficult stories all the time. And I often apologise to people because I say, I'm really sorry that you've had that experience. It sounds horrible. And I think we should all practice that a little bit more, being more kind in interactions, particularly when you're representing an organisation, because it can feel like a behemoth. And having someone sit with you and say, this shouldn't have happened, I'm really sorry, this is what we're doing about it. That's the other part to apologies, which is this is our response. It's really powerful, and it does help people move forward and move on.
Thank you. What a fantastic story and outcome. So the Ombudsman could be considered a complaint-focused organisation, and you have a role in protecting human rights, but you're also independent. How do you ensure you don't stray into the realms of advocacy?
Well, it's really through the independence that we demonstrate day in, day out, all of our work. So independent, it means independent of both sides to a potential dispute. We're independent of the agency complained about. We're also independent of the complainant. And you know, they get quite cross with us sometimes because they think we are going to be their advocate and we're not. And we need to be very clear in an appropriately diplomatic way, using appropriate active listening and language to explain that we are the advocate for neither party, but that we are looking to see what is fair, what is reasonable, and that must be something that you deal with and your staff deal with all the time.
Yeah, we had a long discussion recently about how you tell somebody or how you communicate our independence. And some of our more experienced complaint handlers said you always tell the person that we're independent of the agency first. And so they understand that. And then you say, but we're also independent of you. But it is important to set that out really, really early. And also because of, again, getting back to the discussion about when is a complaint resolved, that's our decision about when a complaint is resolved based on our powers. And yeah, it's important that we maintain that independence.
I'll just add to that. I think, Ben, you've highlighted it's also important to talk internally about communication, and it's a really valuable thing to discuss amongst your colleagues, particularly if you're forward-facing, you're having interactions with the community. Talk amongst yourselves about how to speak about difficult, how to approach difficult conversations, how to talk about things like your role. And I think it's really important that you share the knowledge within your organisation. And I think it's a great thing to spend time doing, and the results you'll benefit from it for sure.
When is conciliation not appropriate?
Look, it's appropriate most of the time, I think. We obviously put a lens on complaints to really think about, okay, is getting a complainant and a public organisation together in a room going to be helpful here? And a couple of things we look for are people open to different ideas? Do they have a resolution mindset? Are they open to discussing and navigating and potentially coming up with some different options? And if we think people have fixed mindsets, then it might not be suitable for conciliation. Sometimes something wrong has happened, and it's okay to have a fixed mindset. We still go through the process because the person is entitled to that mindset. But we do look for a resolution mindset. I think the other thing is things like systemic issues that a complaint's highlighting may not be appropriate, because conciliation is about resolving individual complaints. I mean, we also get outcomes where organisations are making commitments to change things like policies and procedures. So there can be a flow-on effect from resolving an individual complaint. But if the issues are highlighting something systemic, then it might not be appropriate to go to conciliation. And obviously misconduct and serious misconduct is not something that we will conciliate.
So what is the most conciliated matter and how's it usually resolved?
Well, communication, communication. Breakdown in communication, I think, is attached to, whether it's a council complaint about a drain or about public housing. Breakdown in communication is really, something that we see all the time in our office, and it's a ripe issue for conciliating. So we're finding that in a lot of our conciliations that they include a discussion of a communication plan and some real concrete agreements or steps around what communication will look like going forward. So resetting communication norms is a large part of what we do in conciliations, and it's working really well so far. So really understanding what's gone on, what's gone wrong, and then figuring out how to set some infrastructure around that to navigate things that will, complexities that will happen going forward. That's really important part of conciliation.
Is it fair to assume that those conciliation norms are strategies that agencies will then take on?
Yeah, look, communication norms, I think, one of the things about conciliation, it does offer the organisation an opportunity to talk to the complainant about the impact that the way they've engaged is having on their staff and on their organisation. That's a really powerful part because it takes two to tango in some ways in these conciliations. So, we have had matters where organisations will say the amount of the volume and the amount you're contacting us, or the way you're contacting us, the way you're talking to our staff is having a really significant impact. So a communication plan might include commitments around respectful communication. It might include dates when certain things are going to be done by, and really it's aimed at getting things back on track, because often there's been a rupture, and the conciliation provides an opportunity to address the rupture and then think about, okay, well, let's get things back on track, and those are the kind of commitments we get out of conciliation to address that.
And it's only fair that I ask you, what's the most complained about matter and how's it usually resolved?
Communication delay. We have this other subset of issue types, I guess, to use some internal language, and we call it direct action. And to anyone who's not inside this office, I say, people call us because there's a thing they need done and it hasn't been done. Doing the thing, fixing the mold problem, providing the birth certificate, those kind of things. So sort of a direct action. It may well be that there is a process that still needs to be followed to make that happen. But I guess not wanting to go on and on about communication and delay, but there's a kind of direct action element, I think, which is real sort of bread and butter part of our complaint handling.
And interestingly enough, even if delays are unavoidable, they tend to be acceptable if communicated well.
I had a discussion with an agency the other day about how do you update someone if you've got nothing to update them about. And I don't think, is echoed by the good practice kind of material around the various jurisdictions. Updating someone to say, your complaint's still with us, we haven't forgotten about you, there's nothing more we can tell you at this stage, or we're waiting on X, Y, and Z, I think is really good practice and not unreasonable in most cases.
And part of the point of managing expectations, communication. If you're going to provide a time frame, stick to it. And if you're not going to stick to it, explain why you're not going to stick to it. So it's not about setting up a whole lot of things by which you're going to fail. It is actually quite the opposite. It's putting for the realistic steps that you can achieve and managing expectations when things are not realistic.
I've got a question from the floor for you, Deborah. You did a fantastic job reviewing the LGA, or Local Government Association, and hardship policies.
Thank you. That question.
Are you likely to apply the same level of scrutiny to Fines Victoria, DOJ, or Department of Justice?
Well, we apply scrutiny to every agency that we deal with, and the practice within the office is to identify themes and trends that generally emerge from patterns of complaints. So, with financial hardship, for example, local councils, particularly in light of the pandemic, it was obviously a theme that we were likely, that was becoming yet greater. So fines, and I've been public about this, but we did do a report on Fines Victoria. They continue to be, what's that term, frequent flyers as respondents. But we have, I think, constructive working relationships with pretty much all of the agencies who are regularly in our sites. And what we're always doing is looking at the themes and the trends and understanding, is there something here that we should be engaging with further? And sometimes that will result in an investigation. Most of the time it doesn't. And I have often been known simply to write to the head of an agency and go, we've been seeing a pattern of complaints about, this, this, and this. What are you doing about it? And if I get a good response to that, I won't investigate. If I don't get a good response, well, that's a whole other ballgame.
Question for you, Michael. Have public organisations been hesitant to voluntarily participate in conciliation? And if they have, why do you think so?
We started conciliating about 15 months ago, and I think at the start there was some hesitancy. It's a voluntary process, so we need public organisations to agree to participate. And I think, conciliations are dynamic. So there was a bit of fear of the unknown, and organisations have been engaging with our office for a long, long time. So, and that, some of that's predictable, and they know how we're going to make inquiries. They know the kind of answers that we're wanting. So conciliation was new, and I think it's new for it's normal for people to be a little bit not afraid, but hesitant about jumping into something like that. My message for all public organisations was there's not going to be any surprises here. We're going to really equip you with the knowledge and that in a conciliation, it's always going to be constructive dialogue, and if it's not, we'll pull the pin. So that's the commitment we gave to public organisations. Turn up with an open mind, in good faith, come prepared, and there will be no surprises, and it's going to be constructive. And now we're having no public organisations really say no. We might approach a public organisation and say, hey, what do you think about conciliating this? And they might say, well, we're not sure about that for these reasons. And more often than not, we might say, well, yeah, now we can see your reasons. We don't think conciliation is appropriate either. We choose a different path. So, yeah, I mean, when the Ombudsman comes knocking, sometimes people are, a bit nervous. But our message in relation to conciliation is we're after informal resolution. It's about informally resolving the complaint. So there's nothing to be afraid of.
I'll leave it to the panellists to respond to this question. It's come from online. Can you speak to how, if at all, complaints are handled or approached differently for complainants who are prisoners and the unique challenges this presents?
Sure. So around 40% of the complaints received by the Ombudsman are from Victorian prisons. So we have a lot of experience in that area. And we have some real expertise, I guess, in aspects of the administration of the Victorian prisons. I guess the way we approach it generally is we have the gate is much more open to people who are in prison, figuratively, I should say. Yeah. Realise that's a probably problematic metaphor. So prisoners can call us for free from prisons, and their calls jump the queue, partly because their calls are timed and they only get a certain amount of time to speak to us. Because of that, it's a much more verbal kind of a process. We don't ask for things in writing, although prisoners regularly put complaints to us in writing. We don't put lengthy inquiries to prisons. We have phone calls and we have liaisons in all Victorian prisons. So it's a much more dynamic and quick process. A lot of the complaints from prisoners are about day-to-day stuff, access to property, access to programs, movements around different facilities, that sort of thing. So I think it's much more the sort of quick resolution approach. And accepting that we need to change our approach to people with communication needs and certain vulnerabilities. And those kind of issues are more prevalent with people who are in prison. So we need to communicate with people in a much more plain language way.
I'll keep directing this question to you, Ben. How do you seek and use feedback from complainants and entities about the VO complaint process?
All right, so that's two areas, I guess. So feedback from complainants. So complainants can make complaints about the services they've received, and that's escalated to a senior manager who assesses the handling of that particular complaint. Decisions can be reviewed as an internal review, and a senior person not associated with that complaint or that team will review the decision and determine whether that officer, exercised that had regard to all the relevant considerations and acted fairly in the circumstances, to use administrative law speak. So there are very clear avenues for people to provide that kind of feedback. We have a team within the office that assesses those trends from those complaints and complaints that are brought to the Victorian Inspectorate, and kind of looks at the way that we handle complaints and whether any new training or any kind of updates for particular agencies needs to be done. Agencies are also always giving us feedback about how we deal with them, and we really welcome that. We become real experts in the way certain agencies work and certain complaints about certain agencies work. But with almost 1,000 jurisdictional agencies, it's impossible to do across all of it. So we have a very live process of updating the kind of advice material for staff to make sure that we're asking the right questions, considering the right matters when people bring complaints to us and if we're going to be making inquiries. And Fines Victoria is a great example of that. I mean, we worked very hard with Fines Victoria to improve their complaint handling processes. But equally, there are certain aspects of the fine system that we have a limited role in. The Ombudsman doesn't have jurisdiction over the police or the traffic camera office, so there's certain fines we don't have. We can't oversight. And so, working out where the Ombudsman role is, we've relied on our own understanding of the law, but also feedback from the agency about what's realistic.
And also, in terms of post-conciliation, we survey everyone that goes through our conciliation function to understand their experience, and we're always looking for improvements. I think it would be a bit perverse if we, as in the Ombudsman Office, weren't open to feedback and actively seeking it, because, like Deborah said, we understand the value in it. It's really important feedback. And the other thing is we conduct a survey of our general complainants, and so really interesting to hear from them and understand and reflect on their experience and what we can do better.
And a real example of improvements that have come out of that is the way that we communicate with people. We now have much more automated process for SMS updates and an emphasis on calling complainants before we provide final outcomes. And that's really come from the feedback from complainants about, getting an email at the end of a journey with the Ombudsman with a lot of legalistic jargon about reasons is probably not what people need, and a phone call and an explanation is. And that's an improvement I've seen over my time.
I'll throw back to you, Michael. How much preparation work is required by public organisations before they attend to conciliation?
I think often organisations have an experience of the complainant. They know the complainant, they know the issues the complainant has been experiencing, and often they have complained a number of times to the organisation before. There's often people within the organisation that know a lot about the complaint. So, and they're, the kind of subject matter experts, and they're really important to bring them through the conciliation process. And then we need senior decision makers. So, and like I talked about earlier, so when we're sitting in a conciliation, we're thinking about what options are available. Someone senior from the organisation is there and can have input into that discussion. So when you couple those two things together, that's a great combination. Someone who knows the complainant's experience, knows the systems, knows what's possible, and then someone who can make the decisions and commitments that will resolve the complaint. That's the ideal combination. And I think when you put those things together, it doesn't require a heap of preparation. Tap into the knowledge within your organisation and come with an open mind and with the ability to make decisions. And that I think that's all you need to do, really.
Well, this is another question that's come in from the floor, and it's a bit of a two-parter. What cultural competencies do your staff have, and are there some issues identified with complaints handling related to quality or psychological makeup of staff employed? So, cultural psychology.
Very diverse would be the very short answer to that question. But
I mean, I guess in terms of cultural competencies, we have a diverse staff with diverse experiences, and we've got a lot of training in interacting with particular communities and understanding the kind of cultural sensitivities and needs of those communities and those cohorts. In terms of the psychological, that was about the makeup, what makes a good complaint handler, I guess. It's a real, I've always thought it's a real tension between the need to support people and also the need to be focused on the community. And really that takes two mindsets or two approaches. You need to drive standards, and you need to be pushing people to think about what the complainant needs, even if that person's needs, that person's manner is disruptive or difficult. But you also need to think about how you protect people and how you reflect on the work that you do. And the comments Michael made before about talking internally about how to have different conversations and the language you use, it's really, I think it's really helpful and really important. That you kind of wargaming certain scenarios, not certain types of people, but how do you deliver a preliminary outcome to somebody? How do you deliver the kind of news that, the Ombudsman's role is limited, or that we don't think the response from an agency is unreasonable? Where are we using language that's makes sense to us in this kind of a world, but might not make sense to the public? There was an example someone used about, do you say to somebody that's a decision which is open to that agency to make, or does that just sound like a whole lot of gibberish to somebody who feels like they're being treated unfairly? And how do you use the language in a really effective way?
We also ask people how they'd like to be communicated with, and we have a really clear way of recording that. So that's a really important way that people tell us. We ask them and they tell us, and then we try and accommodate those needs.
One final question from the floor, which I'll pose to you, Deborah. How do you manage people who won't accept decisions, are suspicious of information being withheld, and who think you can't do your job properly?
Well, welcome to the world of the complaint handler and the Ombudsman. I think I foreshadowed when we began this webinar that not all complainants are reasonable, not all complaints are reasonable. Every complaints handling office has a core, which I do believe is a small core, but that's not occupy a disproportionate amount of attention of people who are vexatious, unreasonable, will not go away, and will sort of insist upon their rights even when there is not a shred of evidence to support them. So, one answer is we offer training in this. In fact, we offer the Ombudsman's office does do. We've done a lot of work on this, and I think the Ombudsman's offices and ours in particular are subject matter experts on dealing with challenging, complex behaviours. So there is a formal course. Get in touch if you want to attend it. But look, I think that there are some pretty basic responses, I think, that we are all familiar with, and often it's down to the great C word of communication. How you communicate with somebody. Sometimes somebody actually has a point, but they communicate it in such an obstructive or negative or abusive way that all we hear is the abuse and we don't actually hear the complaint. So there is I think a really important skill that complaints handlers need to develop, to understand the core of the complaint, the core of the grievance, and to understand whether there is actually any merit to it, because there may well be. And then we need to think about ways of addressing that, and either sort of stripping away or somehow marginalising the negative conduct that goes along with it. But I also say some complaints do have no merit, and sometimes you just have to say so. You may have some other
No, I
ideas on
agree.
that.
I think I echo everything you said, Deborah. I think be really conscious that you don't want to miss things, and sometimes you need to separate the behaviours from the substance of the complaint, which is tricky, right? And you want to support your staff to be able to do that in a way that's safe for them.
Thank you to each of you for such a robust and interesting discussion. Thank you to all of you for joining us. That's it for today. Keep an eye out for the next in our behind the scenes series of webinars. I'd like to thank the panellists, the Victorian Ombudsman, Deborah Glass, the Principal Officer for Alternative Dispute Resolution, Michael Heffernan, and the Principal Officer for Complaint Strategy, Ben Zika. Do fill in the survey. We look forward to your feedback. Thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon.